Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we try to talk about all kinds of things that will decrease sexual shame, increase mental health, increase relational health, and community health. And today I have with me several members of my Symmetry counseling team. Super excited to have Ellen Alexander joining us from California, Trisha Jensen joining us here from Utah, as well as Rachel Larson and Haley Lewis, all here from Utah as well. So we were excited to talk about all kinds of things today that have been happening in kind of religion news and mental health news. But we have decided to put all of that aside for one particular topic that has come forth in the community of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints this past week, which was an announcement. I don't know if there was an announcement actually, but definitely we have come to find out that there have been some guidelines added to what is called the Bishop's Handbook in regards to trans clients, trans members of the church, as a team of mental health professionals who specialize in both religious, kind of the intersection between religion, mental health, and sexuality. This is obviously a topic that's very important to us. So we're here to talk about those changes. Some of them, unfortunately, I will speak for myself, unfortunately, are not surprising. And yet I cannot begin to express my concern for the harm for transgender members in our church community, the church community that many of us come from. I know Alan does not come from our church community, but works very in depth with people from the LDS. From an LDS background. I will start by kind of referring to the initial letter that I was sent a long time ago now, November of 2020, by my stake president before my excommunication happened in 2021, as to the concerns that they had about me and why I was going to be facing disciplinary process. And one of the things that he said is, in the past, you have posted, and this is a quote of mine, I guess, that they took from social media, "Be very clear. The Mormon Church is currently a toxic, unsafe place for LGBTQ plus members and their loved ones. And whether you realize it or not, that's our entire membership." And I wrote that in June 2019. And then he asks me the question, do you consider the church toxic and unsafe for its members? And my basic answer to that is, of course, yes, I do, for reasons that we're going to discuss today. This is not safe nor mentally sound practices, nor trauma-informed practices that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints exhibits on a consistent, ongoing, chronic basis, specifically geared towards our LGBTQ plus members. And this has an effect, of course, on their family members and their community members who love them and support them, or who are in essence taught to ostracize them or treat them in discriminatory, biased ways. So it affects the entire community. And this is a thorn in the church's side that until better able to have better policies around these things, creates a toxic, unsafe environment at church. And I will also say, just to begin as well, is that a lot of times when we talk about transgender members of the church, or we talk about gay members in the church, or lesbian members, or bisexual members, or asexual members, we automatically have an assumption that we're talking about adults, that we're talking about people who have come out, that we have that we're talking about people who have transitioned, especially when we're talking about transgender folks. And I want to be very clear that a huge part of the population that falls under LGBTQ umbrellas are minors who have not come out, who have not transitioned, who have maybe said peep about these things to their leaders or to their parents even, but are listening and hearing and understanding the climate and the cultural spaces that they are in, which are non-affirming spaces. And I know we'll get into the danger of being a minor in a non-affirming space when it comes to the biggest concern is suicidality, but many other concerns as well: development of mental health concerns and disorders, development of relational concerns, isolation, increase in substance abuse, dependency, many, many things. The research has now for decades, been able to show how LGBTQ folks are not only micro and macro aggressed against, but the results of those micro and macro aggressions. So the church does not get a pass from me as far as ignorance or not being able to be educated on topics that have been very clearly researched by many, many different parts of the mental health community that ongoingly show that these are concerns. So that's my initial soapbox. I would like to kind of go through maybe one by one some of these changes that have been listed, and then we can have a discussion. So one of the things that they said is transitioned transgender members. So these are people who have gone through some type of transition. And again, transition is also an unclear word because transition can mean a lot of different things, right? Transition, people can socially transition, people can physically transition, people can hormonally transition. And then we're not even including intersex members, which never transition and yet have, you know, just different types of biology and different types of chromosomal makeups than those who are not intersex. So what do they mean by transition? But I'm going to assume that what they mean by that is that a person has been presenting as either male or female and are now presenting as the opposite gender. Again, this is very binary. It does not really make a lot of room for non-binary folks in these things. But so transition transgender members can no longer participate in any overnight activities. And to add insult to injury, they don't just stop there. They say must be escorted away from the activity, right? So, okay, it's one thing to say you can no longer participate, but no, we're going to make it clear that there's going to be some formal escorting away from the activity. I think most people can leave an activity without being escorted away. So that just adds a different, I don't know, just kind of feeling that could be kind of forceful in some ways. I think it invites a forceful type of versus an invitation. So any initial thoughts about that or anything else that how about this? I apologize. How about initial thoughts before we get into details? Initial thoughts.
Initial thoughts are maybe this is like a whole other. I'm reminded of the 2021 Muscat fire speech, and I'm like, oops, are you doing it again? I mean, because that didn't go down very well, and it created a lot of resentment among some of the faithful, so to speak. And we've seen a lot of those people distance themselves from the church because this intimately affected members of their own families. I'm also struck by the fact that they say that these individuals, I guess, while being escorted away, should be treated with Christ-like love and compassion. I don't know how marching somebody away from your faith and your organization and your events is Christ-like in any way. The only people I remember Christ escorting out of anywhere was money changers in the temple. So,
thank you.
Initial thoughts, after reading all the sections, I had a very distinct flavor of these people are dangerous. We need to kind of mitigate their impact or their visibility or their access to other members. So it just felt very like separative in order to protect people from the trans members. That's how it came across to me. As I looked quickly, I went to the Human Rights Watch. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that organization, but in 2021, they were putting out some stats about crimes against transgender people. And if you look at the research and the data on crimes involving transgender people, it is largely, they are way more likely to have crimes committed against them than to commit crimes. And so one thing on their website that really struck me, they said recent debates over transgender rights have increased the visibility of transgender rights. Great. And then they go on to say, but have increased hostility towards transgendered people when with lawmakers and media personalities, and I would say, I would add any influential voice, unfairly demonizing transgender individuals as mentally ill, predatory, or dangerous. So when you are increasing visibility about transgender people, but also speaking of them as mentally ill, predatory, or dangerous, you are actually increasing their risk for hostility. And when you're talking about a religious community, the hostility, while it's still violent, it is largely gentle because it's couched in palatable language of we're trying to include everybody and love everybody, but we will escort you off the property. Thank you very much. Those kinds of things, we like they're hiding behind this gentility and this really palatable language, while also really, really increasing the distance between these people are human, these people are predatory and dangerous and mentally ill. So as you look at all these different sections, I feel like as we discuss this, we really need to understand the ways their language is demonizing. And to Natasha, to your point, a lot of these children. And so the way that it makes them feel and view themselves, sure, but also the way that other people view them increases, like it disconnects people rather than connects. And it makes it very, very difficult for any child to feel safe because they have now been labeled and not explicitly, implicitly labeled. And that's even harder to fight. So that was my first initial thought of like, okay, there's some underlying messages that are getting put through here that are going to have huge effects because the church has a very large influence and voice here, but no one's saying it explicitly because they can't, otherwise it's on Christ, like that's not a good look. So they're not going to say it out loud, they're going to say it really quietly in the actions and then pretend that it's falling under this inclusion thing. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
Thank you, Rachel.
My initial thoughts are, I agree with Rachel on the line between where is the Christ-like love, right, and what we need to do for our legalistic policies. It's my initial thoughts are like, this is obviously something that the church has been wrestling with for a long time. I don't think it's mostly transgender members like raising concerns because they do feel so unsafe and not able to speak out. So I think it largely comes from leaders, family members, things like that, that are really wanting to love and support these transgender members and know how to support that. And this kind of ties their hands on being able to support in loving ways. And so I think that a lot of local leaders, a lot of members are really struggling with how to support while staying in the church and engaging in that community. So I think it's something that we really need to look into.
Thank you, Haley.
I agree. I think that as far as I've seen a lot of boards, a lot of members really trying to wrap their arms around the LGBTQ community and open their voice within the church to help change. And then something like this comes out and it really ties their hands because now they have to choose. And I found it really devastating on so many levels. But one of the parts that was so harsh was just this assumption that trans people are perpetrators because you're being treated like a perpetrator in a church where there are lots of perpetrators that hold the priesthood, and the church has continually uh, hidden that. And there's been a lot of forgiveness. There's been a lot of, continued callings, continued time with children, continued influence within the church because they are cisgender or good public speakers and fit into the community. We have trans people in my neighborhood that are active members of the church, and my heart went out to them and for everyone who loves them because they've made it so comfortable for them to worship. And I think we make this assumption that if you're in the queer community, why would you want to be Mormon? And that is true for a lot of people, but that's not true for all. There's a lot of people in the queer community that really want to be part of the church and active participating parts. And so to me, this felt very violent and hurtful, wrapped up in a beautiful bow of, the language like Rachel talked about. I thought the language felt very gaslighty to me, and it was really hard. It's been a hard week.
Yeah, this is somewhat reminiscent of what happened in 2015 with the policy around children, in particular of gay and lesbian and bisexual people who were in same-sex relationships. And, I think we saw an increase of people leaving the church officially, like officially resigning from the church during that time frame. Then 3 years later, they changed that policy, which also was very confusing to members as to why would a church that basically, credits itself for acting on God's behalf, change a policy in such a short amount of time. Who's really running the show, is quote unquote God changing his mind or her mind, in 3 years' time, or are these biases and limitations that obviously the leaders have, in trying to make sense of topics that they're really kind of uninformed about and continue to stay uninformed, I think, in some very intentional ways around these issues. So going into maybe some of the specifics, and I know, Haley, you have less time with us available than the rest of us. If there's a particular point you want to make, please make sure that the way I'm kind of thinking through how we're going to talk about these things doesn't limit what you want to share. But going back to this kind of overnight activities, what's interesting to me about this is that it assumes, what does this assume? Like, why would somebody not be able to have an overnight activity with people who, they identify as the same gender as being? And to me, this kind of smacks of like sexual anxiety, that people are going to have a higher interest in quote unquote behaving sexually with somebody who, if one of you owns a penis and one of you owns a vagina, it doesn't matter how you identify in your gender, somehow everybody's going to have sex somehow. So first of all, what's interesting to me about this is that we're already ignoring the fact that we have gay and lesbian members in the church. Because, gay and lesbian members of the church go on missions and sleep with people that they might be sexually attracted to on a daily basis, right? They're roommates with these people. These people exist at school universities, right? Like you might be in a roommate situation with somebody who is sexually attracted to you. So it just kind of speaks of the naivete or the kind of ignorance around how sexual attraction and behavior works. Like you already have a problem, church, if this is what you're worried about, because you're already having people at overnight activities. So if that's what you're really worried about, maybe you should just stop having any overnight activities at all, because people explore, people have sexual attractions, people have sexual behaviors, whether they're cisgender, whether they're transgender, whether they're straight or lesbian or gay, like all these people sexually explore with all different kinds of people. So if you're really concerned about this being the thing, may just stop having overnight activities altogether? Why limit that to one very small segment of the population when I know that these things are happening regardless of how people identify? Any thoughts on that?
Language really interesting also that said from overnight activities that are not for a specific gender, meaning all genders could be welcome there, but individuals who pursue surgical, medical, or social transition. So that's even talking about just pronouns, or a different name or something. Then they have to leave the activity at night, even though all other genders are welcome. So it doesn't really matter how someone presents. It doesn't really matter. Everybody was supposed to be welcome there. But if you're trans, you can't. Like that was so strange to me. At an when it said at an activity where all genders were supposed to be present. And so it just begs the question, what is the angle here? Like what you were saying, is this about sexual anxiety? Or are we worried about people engaging in sexual activity? Because then the obvious answer is maybe no overnight activities if you're really that. Is it about someone could be committing a crime, or is someone dangerous? Because in that case, are we monitoring who actually has committed crimes? Have we uninvited those people? Is it about, the statistical probability of something happening? In that case, should we maybe have disbarred men or something, because we're talking about statistically who is committing crimes in overnight activities, not church activities? If we just look at those stats, are we just barring one gender? Because if we are, we're looking at the wrong one. Those kinds of questions came to mind of like, what is the angle here? Because I can't tell exactly what they're trying to either protect from, ensure, or prevent. It's just, it's unclear. It just didn't exclusion without an explanation.
Well, and it's just a perceived threat, right? Like there's an overall perceived threat if someone's trans. And you're not talking about, I mean, they're covering every type of transitioning, even going by a different name, Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think it's really harmful to escort someone out of anything. I think that's like court of law, criminal behavior. You have to be escorted. And I love what you just said about the statistics, and the statistics are against men. You're 100% right. And the protection of the church has always been for men.
Well, let's be clear, white cisgender men.
Mhm.
White cisgender men that hold privilege in our church community are the people who are generally protected. So let's just quickly go into what I think is the biggest issue here, is that this transgender members can no longer hold callings with youth or children. So this is just fascinating to me. And I think there's two angles here, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong. But one is, now you're treating transgender folks like perpetrators. And if we're really worried about perpetration in the church, we need to really address the vast amounts of sexual abuse that have happened by priesthood, white, cisgender men in our church. We have never sufficiently addressed that issue at all. That's continues to be an issue that's swiped under the rug. And it continues to hurt people. And that's who you're in most danger from in our church, is white cisgender men with priesthood power behind closed doors, at scouting events, in bishops' interviews, as Sunday school teachers, as young men leaders. These are where people get perpetrated against, is it these types of activities by these types of people. So where are all the protocols to protect us from that, right? And why do white cisgender men continue to have access to children without background checks, without adequate training, without trauma-informed training? Why do we continue to do that, right? So if the church really wants to put some money or some effort behind something in regards to protecting children in the church, that should be their number one concern. And I've seen hardly anything being done about this other than hotlines that protect those men and protect the church and protect the reputation, and never the victims. So let's be very clear about that. The second angle of this is that, and I believe this is really kind of where the anxiety piece comes in, is that adults in the church are quote unquote protecting children from the influence of transgender people. Just the fact that somebody could be transgender might influence my poor little innocent child because I'm so freaking uncomfortable with my own biases and discriminations that I couldn't bear the thought of my poor little tiny innocent child having access or seeing a transgender person being treated like a normal human being. And that's where we have a whole nother different type of discrimination and issue. We saw this, of course, with people of race. We saw this with people who were gay and lesbian. And now we're seeing it with transgender folks, right? Like protect the children from the people we are uncomfortable with because they are different from me. And, you know, Lord help us if by any chance a trans person would influence my child to be trans. That I think that's really what this is about, because protecting children from perpetrators in our church has never been a priority. So I think that this is really what this is about, is protecting children from the normalization of trans folks.
Well, and
Yeah,
what's also disturbing is the fact that they say that there's that they could have an annotation on their membership records. But this is the same place that you make annotations for people who've stolen money from the church, committed fraud against the church, committed incest, they've been sexually predatory or been sexually violent. So make no mistake, this is, when they're being escorted, this is a perp walk.
Which, by the way, I've never seen anybody escorted from any building because they were actually like on the sexual predator list or anything like that. In fact, I've had quite a few complaints throughout my career of folks in wards where they're like, you know, hey, we have somebody on the perpetrator list attending our ward, and there's been no precautions as to whether or not they should be chaperoned into a restroom, or, you know, there's nobody chaperoning them. How do I know my child is safe when I know this person has this predatory history? So I've never once seen anybody escorted from any church building for reasons that I might find actually reasonable. But now all of a sudden we're using this language. So yes, I agree, Alan. Haley?
Yeah, I think it goes to the language choices in this document as well of, you know, people can say, oh, escorting is just, you know, their parents coming to pick them up. Why are we making such a big deal out of this? But no, this really does give permission for local leaders, other parents of children, like you said, Natasha, about that are worried about, you know, transgender kids being around their kids, transgender adults being their teachers. It goes to the permission it kind of gives to, you know, have this like grand exit, you know, of transgender youth and adults. And it's really, really devastating.
I think to your point, Haley, also, you can look at this language that they use here and say that they would be released to the care of a parent or legal guardian who's responsible for arranging accommodation. You can easily spin that as they just need to be picked up by their parent or guardian. And so it's just about arranging transportation. That says nothing of the people that can, you know, walk to and from an activity or drive themselves or whatever, because they have to be released into the care of. But if you look down at the restrooms and church facilities section, also when they're saying using a restroom that corresponds to the individual's feeling of their innocence or gender or whatever, they have to have a trusted person with them, a trusted person ensuring that others are not using the restroom at the same time. They have to be escorted to the restroom to make sure that nobody else is there at the same time. So you can't just say, oh, they just needed a ride. This is an actual escort to the bathroom. That's a big deal when you're talking about the way that a person sees themselves and the way that other people see them, you know, in the bathroom. I don't know about you guys. I was speaking with a mother of a trans boy yesterday about these policies, and she's like, when are we presented with people's genitals in the restroom? only when a baby's being changed. Like nobody's walking up and checking people's genitals. People are going into the bathroom, coming out of the bathroom, doing what they need to. Like this is not a situation where we are typically in danger of anything, or even knowing how a person presents and if it's different than what's underneath their clothing. Like that's not a thing that we're presented with. So have to have an escort means they have to come out with it first and talk about it, even though they normally would not. In any other restroom in the world, they would not be faced with this.
Well, I think a trans person typically will do anything in their power not to use a restroom anywhere, because they are at risk way more than anyone else in that bathroom, right? Like it's a lot like racism back in the day. You would hold it as long as you could and do everything in your power to not offend by using the restroom. And that in and of itself is horrible, because that's a natural feeling in the trans community. And then to have it spelled out that you would need an escort. I remember being in a ward and nobody knew. I didn't know what was going on. I just knew the bishop stood up and said, please don't use the restroom alone. Make sure your kids have someone with them. Make sure that you go to the bathroom in pairs. And later to find out it's because we had men on the sex offender list that were going to church and that something had happened in a bathroom, right? And instead of that person being escorted, like the trans community is now being asked to be escorted, the bishop wanted all of us to be clear to go to the bathroom in pairs, protecting the actual perpetrator, which that's a huge problem. Obviously, that's a trigger. I have transference on that because it's a trigger for me, because there's just so much protection for actual predators, and then such a violent language here that you would need an escort to go to the bathroom. It's like The Help all over again, the book The Help all over again. We just need to put toilets all over the front lawn of churches for our trans community and just let them know.
Well, and I've had several clients tell me ever since Utah passed the bathroom laws where it's actually illegal to use a bathroom that doesn't match your biological anatomy, I guess, that they have canceled trips. They're afraid to drive, long distances, because where are they going to find a bathroom to be able to go to? Very few places have facilities that are either single, like single stall facilities, or that have trans affirming restrooms. And so people have
one separately designated as an all gender.
Right. Like do people not understand? Like, this is a basic human right, is to be able to relieve yourself.
The only thing I'm concerned about going to the bathroom is, God, I hope it's clean.
Right. So it's just so upsetting on so many levels, so dehumanizing, right? That like this, when you're talking about basic bodily functions like eating and relieving yourself, drinking water, these are basic human rights that now are being, withheld in our church, in our own church buildings. Moving along, and I'm not reading my bullet list, by the way, from the church handbook. I'm reading them from the list that Kyle Ashworth came up with on his post on Latter-day Stories, which I highly recommend following him. He's always really on top of a lot of these things. So it's kind of his language of kind of making bullet points of the shifts and changes. So number 3, which is actually the only one that I was kind of thinking, okay, this is at least somewhat okay, is that pronouns and preferred names are between the individual, family, and church members. The church will allow the member to include their preferred name on their membership records. I'm like, okay, we have one possible positive here in this whole mess of things that have things. But we know, again, through a lot of the research, that having your preferred pronouns respected, having your name respected, is a huge factor for mental health. I mean, just think about that for a minute. Think about if every single time, for those of us who are cisgender, think about somebody purposefully calling you the opposite pronoun from what you are. Think about how disorienting and upsetting that would be, and how many times you'd correct somebody. Think about somebody getting your name wrong. I'm embarrassed if I get somebody's name wrong 3 times, right? And just meeting a new person, because I get the sense that that's their identity. That's who they are. They don't want to be misnamed. I know, I get called Natasha, I get called Natasha, I get called, different things. It doesn't really bother me when people have different accents or whatever, but immediately I'm like, oh yeah, that's not how you really say my name. That's just a simple, tiny little mistake, right? And so to really misname or dead name a person when they've made it clear, that really hits an identity piece of yourself that is very difficult to not have respected. So I am glad that they're at least making room for that. But going on, transitioned members are no longer allowed to fully participate in young single adult conferences for strength of youth or general youth conferences. It doesn't, I guess, go by my attention that, first of all, and I think we would all agree with this, the amount of people who are starting to identify as queer, as fluid, as something other than the binary, especially in the younger generations, is growing exponentially, right? Which is, I think, of course, why people are anxious about this, especially older white cis people who are anxious about the shifts happening in younger generations, and why they think that this is an impact of influence. And in some ways, it is and it isn't, right? A trans person is not going to be any less trans because somebody influenced or didn't influence them. At the same time, what we do know that happens in communities all over the world is that when something is given more permission, when you're given permission to be who you are without fear of retribution, without fear of consequence, then yes, more people are likely to come out and be public instead of private, or give themselves permission to even think about their own gender identity. And so in some ways, the church is right that if we are more affirming and more accepting of people, then more people will feel that permission to come out and to be honest with themselves and with others, and not be in a space of identity foreclosure, which I have worked with all the 50 and 60 and 70-year-old folks who dealt with 30 years of identity foreclosure. And I guess people in their church communities were much more comfortable with them, but I can tell you that they themselves were not very comfortable with themselves and had huge impacts in their personal relational lives because they were held othered, right? So this just seems really interesting to me that the church either does have its pulse or does not have its pulse on the younger members of the church being much more queer friendly, being much more likely to not identify on that binary. And so how many people are now not going to be able to attend basic activities for single adults and the youth in the church, or continue to hide who they are so that they can?
Well, I do think that within like that adolescent age, there is this time where you're kind of figuring yourself out. And the whole idea of becoming like the queerness being the flu and people are going to catch queer and become part of it is like a fear, because some of these kids, as they're fluid and figuring themselves out, if they are in a group of friends and everybody is queer, they may be like, I don't know, maybe I am, right? And they're kind of figuring it out. Then later in life, how many of that group of friends are actually queer? Not all, typically, right? Not all who thought they would be. But I think that the fact that they had that community to help them work through those adolescent years is key for their mental health, because it's such a lonely, hard place to be. And I know from personal experience, loved ones that have done that and have been non-binary, knowing that their person that they love is, and wanting to make it a softer space for them. And I think that the church sees it as a trend or a flu, and that if they open the floodgates, everyone will do it, not recognizing that it's part of growth and finding yourself, and that where you land in life may not be thank heavens, may not be who you were when you were 13. We all change and grow. And so I think it's a privilege that the church don't see, well, that's not my problem. We have our community. We don't need to make a space for this community. And it's privilege 101.
Yeah, can I jump in here? I absolutely agree with you. It's kind of really shows the black and white thinking in this specific religious community of this, like, if you know who you are a child of God, you are this gender from your gender is eternal, things like that, without the flexibility of just being able to explore yourself and change your mind. We all can change our mind, and not going into like whether it's a choice or not, but just this identity piece of just trying to explore yourself, figure out who you are. Like you said, Trisha, like, I am not who I was at 13. I am not who I was at 25. We are constantly evolving and changing, and the church really needs to find a space for us to just be flexible and to hold our kids in that flexible space as their parents. It's huge.
Well, and I want to point out, because we're talking about development, that all of the developmental stages that are listed by so many different associations within the mental health community list both sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the normative sexual development, adolescent development, and emerging adulthood development. That this is actually the work we're supposed to be doing, that we're supposed to have the permission and the environment to be able to start thinking about, what am I sexually interested in? How do I identify? How do I orient? What are my preferences? How do I, think about my gender and interact with the world, whether it's through gender expression or gender identity or gender preference. And those are very normal parts. So we are actually discouraging, and I can't say this stronger, we are discouraging and developmentally stunting our adolescents and our emerging adults on the regular, just with basic, even heterosexual, cisgender sexual issues. We are developmentally stunting people so that they stay in these standards of behavior that we have deemed as righteous, which I cannot express enough how this sets people up for decades of issues within their own selves, with the relationships that they partner with interference of sexual pleasure, interference of identity development, that they're going to have to do at some point, right? Or I guess die suppressed, which plenty of people have done in the history of the world, sadly. But this is work that you're just kicking the can down the road. You're making that can much more complicated than if you just allow people to go through the normal parts of human development that have been very well researched and studied for, again, decades. I mean, we're talking about Ericksonian theory, which was decades ago, right? That we started understanding how children and adolescents and emerging adults develop.
Do you think that the church understands how this is going to affect all of the people that love these people? Because I never want to speak in absolutes when I'm talking about, like, the priesthood versus the trans. There's plenty of good people in the church. In fact, I think there's a lot of good people in the church. And I'm wondering if the church sees the ripple effect of all of us who love our queer community now are at a crossroads because of this. I'm sorry for cutting you off, Alan.
Oh, that's all right. I was, like I said earlier, I think back to 2021 and the Muscat speech and the fallout from that. And we all know that we experienced a very big influx of people, of clients that time to our practices, who no longer could hold that same space with the church. They were having faith crises. And to the other point, it's not, to what Natasha said, it's not the LGBTQI plus community that is flooding our session rooms. Sure, there's some, but it's mostly heterosexual couples who've been so sexually repressed that they have miserable marriages in this area. That's who we're treating, is the people that the Mormon Church is most interested in supporting, is heteronormative cisgender couples. Yet those are the people that are most often seeking our help, because just being heterosexually normative in your sexual development is still depressed. So of course, these people who are othered, cinified, are going to feel that even more intensely. But the church is not doing a great job at creating good couples marriages in a lot of instances, sadly.
Yeah, go ahead,
And
Rachel.
if they can't get that right, then how are the people who don't fit in that mold ever supposed to fit in?
I completely agree. I have to jet out pretty soon, but I did want to say, like, I feel like one of the most important themes here is this theme of influence, and the idea that we have to remove trans individuals from their visibility so they can influence another person. And I think if you could follow the logic all the way back on that, if that were true, if people could just like change sexual orientations just by being exposed to something, then we wouldn't have had any gay kids in the church, right? Like, just having influence from being around heteronormative people in their lives didn't change them. And so, like, looking at what the influence actually is, but knowing that this church has such a huge influence on our communities, it's very important about what they do, what they say, because like Alan, what you're saying, there are trickle down effects. And then even the heteronormative couples are having trickle down effects from what the teachings have been sexually or otherwise. And I came across a quote that I find very shocking and horrific, but this is kind of about using their influence in order to discriminate, in order to set up a conformative identity for the whole church. And so it's influencing the way that members are viewing other people and the way that they're viewing themselves. It completely skewed the view by taking this tack that we're speaking for God. So our influence is huge. And the person that is in line to become their next leader, this is Dallin Oaks, said, it would also be desirable to allow employers to exclude homosexuals from influential positions in media, literature, and entertainment, since those jobs influence the tone and ideals of a society. Now, I don't have time to go into, like, all where he was speaking, like all of the context. You can look this up. He said it, but we're talking about ways in which we can limit somebody. This is calling for blatant discrimination. And when you talk about things like this, of blatant discrimination, of every gender is welcome to this overnight activity except for transgender, like we're really trying to discriminate in ways that influence the entire community's view of a particular population. And that has huge effects on individuals, families, and communities. But when we're talking about danger levels for children, and Natasha, to your point, the natural human development, it stunts everyone. It targets a specific population, but it stunts everyone. And so looking at the ways that they're using their influence, it's frightening to me, because it's so damaging. It's saddening also, but it's not just one of those, oh, sad. I wish they wouldn't have said that, because there are huge impacts to our communities when big sweeping statements like this get made. So anyway, I've loved this discussion. I'm sorry I have to jet, but thank you, Natasha, for this awesome topic.
Thank you for joining us, Rachel.
I've also got to duck out, so thank you for having me.
Thank you, Haley. And whoever wants to keep on with me, I'll keep on keeping on. So yeah, the next thing that, I want to share is this idea that people who have gone through a transition will no longer be allowed to have a teaching calling. I think that this also speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about in regards to influence, right? That they don't want, in other words, they want to discredit transitioned transgender members. And if you give them a calling where they're visible and can have influence, that will somehow make it okay then to have gone through a transition. And they don't want to do that. Again, I'll give a little tiny bit of credit where credit is due. At least they didn't say they can't have any calling. But again, they're basically saying that we don't want transgender folks front and center, being able to show that they are worthy, righteous individuals that have a right to have influence within our community. Is that fair?
Mhm.
Okay. And then the last thing is the bathroom one, right? And so, before I go to the bathroom, participation of a transition member in a gender specific class, so young men, young women, priesthood or relief society, should be limited and rare after first receiving approval from area presidency, right? So again, it's no secret that our meetings are very gendered. Yeah, it's very, our whole dogma and ways that we think about the world within the Latter-day Saint community is very gendered. The roles you can have, even as cisgender people, cisgender women cannot hold the priesthood. Lori Lee Hull, who is a trans member of our community who was born male assigned at birth and held the priesthood, was a stake president, was employed by the church, played a big role in the Provo Temple. It's an architect, I believe, if I remember correctly, professionally. So played a big role in getting the Provo Temple built and restored after the fire that happened in that building. Now is transitioned, as female, as a trans woman, has lost all their privileges, right? And yet held the priesthood at one point. So we are not equipped to even know how to handle gender because we don't know how to handle it well in just even the cisgender norms, right? Like, what's your role as a woman in the church? What is your role as a man in the church? What roles do you play as a parent? What roles do you play as far as financially providing for your family? Like, we are very much stuck in 1950 gender roles as a church in general. So there is really, there's already enough complications. When you add the trans component, it's like the church blows up. It's like its brain cannot handle how to manage some of those issues. So where does a non-binary member, and I've had these families show up, right? Like I've had these families show up in my office. It's like, well, we go to sacrament meeting and then we go home, because after sacrament meeting, it's gendered meetings for the most part, unless you're going to Sunday school. And where does our non-binary child go? And, where does our child who does not want to attend young women's, doesn't feel very comfortable in young men's? Right. And I think this is going to be more and more the case, is that these very binary, rigid ideas of who you should be as a person just because of your anatomy is not really resonating even with cisgender youth.
Yeah, I find even with my deconstructing clients, one of the hardest parts is that they've always been told who they are, why they're here, what their purpose is, and figuring out who they actually are outside of being told who they are. And these are cisgender people, right? The unraveling of that is so painful. And then if you are part of the trans community and you're told our church is so, you're right, our church is so binary. I remember people saying, you got to go to the temple as a couple on date night, and being like, but why? We don't even sit by each other. We're totally separate in all things. In the church is such a binary religion that I think I'm always in awe of the people that that fight so hard to stay as a trans person, wanting to figure out a way to make this work in such a binary church. And I think that's what makes this so heartbreaking, is they're clawing at just staying. And then something like this comes out where it's just like the church basically just saying, stop. We don't want you. Stop clawing. And yeah, in their heart of hearts, they feel like they know they're still children of God, and they still believe in so much of the church that I think it's underestimated how painful this is. The statistics of suicidality with trans people anyway is so high. It's such the idea that, it's a fad or a trend is so offensive when you think about what they're going through and how hard it is to live their truth. It's really devastating.
Well, and to a point that was made earlier in the show, trans violence against trans folks is also much higher. And anytime you give these types of policies, it gives, in a sense, kind of like this indirect or even direct permission to discriminate, and discrimination can turn violent very easily. And so the church has to bear responsibility for that, right? Which they oftentimes do not want to do. Well, they never want to take responsibility for violence that occurs from understandings of the members that give permission basically from discrimination, right? And the church does not want to take responsibility for that. So restrooms, let's just kind of cover this last piece and then we can wrap up. But restrooms should provide a safe and a private and safe environment. Well, I don't know. I mean, I've had to fart and poop in front of people. I mean, how safe and private is it? I mean, if we're really that concerned about it, should we just have, private bathrooms all along a certain wall or something? If you really want privacy and safety, we've already talked about how same sex people, same gender folks can still be perpetrators. You can be in a bathroom with a man and a boy who gets perpetrated against. You can be in a bathroom, quite frankly, with a woman and a girl who gets perpetrated against, although those numbers are not as common, but they still happen. Individuals who pursue surgical, medical, or social transitioning away from their biological sex at birth should use a single occupancy restroom when available. Well, I've been to a lot of churches, and I don't know that we make a lot of those available in most churches that I've seen within the LDS meeting houses patterns. If a single occupancy restroom is not available, a local leader counsels with the individual and the parents or guardians of a youth to find a solution. Options include using a restroom that aligns with the individual's biological sex at birth. Again, for some people, especially if they've transitioned medically and hormonally, that's very awkward, because although I don't like to use this term, because there are so many members who are not passing, and passing is a way to discriminate also, but there are many people that you would not know are transgender. Believe it or not, you would not know it, because they pass in this way that we as society, tells you that you should look to, again, make society comfortable. And so are those people supposed to now go into a bathroom where they obviously do not fit the social norm, right? I think people have a lot of ideas about trans folks.
Are they seriously asking for a woman who is fully transitioned, has a full beard, looks all intents and purposes like a guy? Are they really asking for that?
Right, for a trans man.
For them to go into the women's restroom? That is really what they're saying?
Right.
How as a woman would you feel if you saw a bearded individual walk into your restroom?
Well, and that's the whole issue too, right? Is that this all kind of falls under a spectrum of passing, which we're not talking about. And so then people who look more androgynous, either naturally or look androgynous because they are going through a transition, or maybe they don't care if they pass, or maybe they just don't pass. These are the people that are going to be really at much more danger of being discriminated against than the people who do pass. And that's a whole nother conversation. Anyway.
Do you think that, I was going to say, do you think that the church is, I mean, I was wondering this, I'm like, is the church envisioning drag coming through their bathrooms? And do they misunderstand that, enjoying to dress drag does not mean you are trans? They're not like synonymous. I think some people think it's synonymous. Like if you're trans, then you love drag. That's not synonymous. And so sometimes when I've talked to well-meaning, and I'm offering grace here, well-meaning Latter-day Saints who are like, well, but you can see how that would be uncomfortable. They're not looking at it like this person actually presents as the sex that they feel they are. They're thinking of drag.
I would agree with that. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions and miseducation about drag. And I don't know the statistics of how many people who participate in drag would consider themselves transgender. I know many gay men who participate in drag. I know many lesbian women who participate in drag and would not identify as trans. I know plenty of non-binary people who participate in drag, right? So drag is, most people do not go to church in drag. Like that's not really what's happening. But I do think that your point is that there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of stereotypes. There's a lot of miseducation about what we're really talking about. Anyway, and then the last option they give is to use a restroom, like Rachel was saying, with a trusted person, ensuring that others are not using the restroom at the same time. So again, lots of lots of hoops that you're supposed to go through. And another place I had seen the option of basically plan on having other accommodations. Right.
So we're supposed to stand outside the bathroom with a sign that says, danger, trans person emptying their bladder. Right. You're supposed to say, block the door and say, sorry, nobody can come in, which also it doesn't even, this is not how bodily functions work, right? Like sometimes you've got diarrhea that doesn't wait. Sometimes you've got to vomit. It's not going to wait for somebody to wait, thank you for being out here with your sign. Like if I don't get access to a bathroom, we're going to have a problem right here in the hallway, which quite frankly, I wouldn't mind that happening a few times for some of this stuff to maybe go by the wayside. I remember even in my excommunication, this was a big issue, was that the women who came to witness for me were not allowed to go inside and use the restroom. So I don't know what people are expecting to have happen in that space.
And those women had temple recommends.
Yeah, that's a whole nother issue. Those were all cisgender white women who were not allowed access to the building because I guess they were dangerous for different reasons, right? That they were witnessing for me. Where I would like to move next is, as therapists and wellness coaches, what is our responsibility to both alert the church and alert the public that this is not okay? Again, going back to my excommunication, there was a list of, I think, almost 2,000 therapists who signed a letter that was written not on behalf of me, but on behalf of the principles I was standing up for, right? Support of gay marriage, for example, support of sexual development, not being cinephized, things like masturbation being normative. And just recently, just last year, I presented at a conference here in Utah where I raised many of these issues, like, are we trans affirming therapists? And a lot of the feedback I received from that presentation was things like, well, the snarky comments were, well, I guess what I learned today is that I can't be an LDS therapist and be a good therapist, right? Like basically Natasha saying that because of my beliefs, I can't be a good therapist. And I am kind of saying that. I am kind of calling to the LDS therapists. What are you doing? What are you saying? Now I'm excommunicated. So they discredited me, right? They said Natasha's voice doesn't matter. She's a fringe therapist. This is not fringe therapy, people. This is evidence-based, research-based, ethics-based therapy. What are the Latter-day Saint therapists and wellness coaches how are they going to respond? Back in the trenches, quietly, while people who are bleeding come into their offices and are suicidal, and they will not say anything vocally or verbally to the church leaders that this is not mental health practice? This is not good for people in our community. What is the role of therapists and the wellness community and the mental health community, the psychiatrists? There's thousands of them in this state, right? There's thousands of Latter-day Saint active mental health practitioners. What are they saying to the church about this?
I think our individual voices are important, but I think that where we can affect the most good is to contact whatever accrediting or certification or professional membership organizations we belong to, and urge for advocacy and voice in this area. I think it matters more when organizations hear from organizations. And so for somebody like Utah's Association of Marriage and Family Therapists to come out and say something, for any group, therapy group to come out, regardless of orientation or licensing status, to come out and say something, where are the medical professionals saying, no, this is harmful, this is not great? You know, it's been done nationally for some of the national organizations like the American Association of Pediatrics and things like that. They've come out and said things. But I think at the state level and at the local level, things need to happen that way too. Because I think it's larger voices tend to be heard more so. Because if individually, I'm not saying we should be quiet and we should pass the buck. We should say what we need to say, and we should stand up for what we need to stand up for. But I think our advocacy efforts should be directed through our organizations, because they have a larger voice, a larger membership, and larger visibility, and they can't be dismissed so easily as fringe the way that you can as an individual.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And the Mormon Mental Health Association has done that, right? They have come out with several position statements around many of these issues that affect the Mormon and Latter-day Saint community. I'm a member of UAMFT. I will definitely be, bringing this up to the board, but I would really kind of publicly call on UAMFT, on the Utah Association for Social Workers, the Utah Association for Certified Mental Health Counselors. I'm not sure, that the psychiatrists that they've got, I'm guessing they've got a Utah division, psychiatric nurse practitioners, like there has to be some type of feedback that in my experience, unfortunately, I often see many more Latter-day Saint professionals being complicit with harmful practices of the church than to actually be speaking up against them. And I think there's probably three types of professionals, right? There's the professional who actually agrees with the church, They have not been able to separate their professional identity from their personal faith identity, which is unethical.
Yes, it is.
That is an unethical way to practice. And I want to educate the public on this. It is unethical to have a Muslim therapist, a Catholic psychiatrist, a Mormon nurse practitioner impose their beliefs onto you, even if they are the same beliefs. That is unethical practice.
I can't tell you how many clients I've had that had therapists that took bishop pay, and I'm frankly horrified at some of the things that they have put forth in therapy with these clients. Well, I'm going to say therapy because that's not therapy. It's indoctrination. They were just holding the church line when this person was in pain and distress. And then, of course, therapy wasn't successful. And then they come along later and they meet somebody like me, and I find that I'm having to undo further harm. And above all else, we should be doing no harm in this profession.
Yeah. Well, and I will give a shout out to the fact that we at Symmetry Counseling still receive bishop pay. So there are bishops out there that do their homework and that find ethical therapists, not just therapists who will, toe the party line. And we've seen the myriad of issues that, Jody Hildebrandt, for example, who made the news, the national news, is just a tip of an iceberg of a lot of issues that we have here in the state of Utah. And I would say these issues also correlate to the Bible Belt because living in evangelical Wichita for over a decade, these same issues usually are the case in many conservative religious cultures, not just in Latter-day Saint land.
Right.
So you have those therapists who are just basically like, I believe this too, and I'm going to practice unethically and medical malpractice, basically. Then you have the therapists who are like, well, I don't agree with what the church is saying or doing, but I don't want to, I don't want to, say anything. I don't want to get in trouble with the church. I'm also a member of the church. I love my church. I don't want to have discipline against me. Maybe I rely obviously on church members to come to me because I'm trusted within the community. So they just stay silent and they say nothing. And one of these examples, and I'll just share this, and if you all need to go, I'm happy to talk by myself. So I apologize. I'm definitely having a moment of feeling and transference. But I went to, again, a UAMFT conference where a man gave a really good presentation on suicidal, kind of suicide awareness. We all need suicide CEs. So he gave a good presentation on that. And he works at BYU. And he gave a presentation of a family he was working with. And it was this young man with his parents. And we got to watch how he helped the parents show up in an affirming way for the kid. And the kid able to say, that he was gay to his parents, and the parents being able to accept him, and that this was going to help decrease this kid's suicidality, rate. And everybody was like, oh my goodness, this is so wonderful. And this is so great. And it was, but the whole time I did not have that response. I did not have the response of, oh, this is so wonderful. I'm like, this is the trench work. We're not talking about why is this kid in this position to begin with? Why are these parents in this position to begin with? Why are we having to do this suicidal prevention that at BYU is rampant because BYU is having these policies from these church leaders who are not trauma informed, who are not LGBTQ affirming, who are not providing affirming spaces to a large segment of our community and population. So we're all like, yay, we learned how to basically stop the bleeding. Why is the bleeding happening? And nobody addressed that in this meeting. Nobody talked about it. Like, these are harmful practices. And we as a profession are not speaking up. So there's those types of therapists. And then, of course, there's the therapists who advocate and who oftentimes get discredited and who, do have loud voices and who are critiqued and criticized, or who leave the church themselves. They're like, I don't want to be part of this unhealthy, organization. But that doesn't help the people who still stay either necessarily. So I just want to for a moment, just have a talk about us as professionals and how systemic of an issue this is and why I'm just livid a lot of
It's definitely a tightrope, because you're right. Like, too much advocacy, you lose credibility. And I think the church is really afraid of normalizing these things. I remember when Modern Family, the TV show, came out, members of the church being like, I will not watch that because it normalizes gay relationship in the show. And I think that's one of the fears in the church, is this normalizing of sexual growth, exploration, LGBTQ, friends, family, not being the big bad wolf. Right? There's a lot of power in keeping that monster locked up in the closet and everyone being afraid of it and having this common enemy. And so I do think that the loudest voices sometimes end up in the church, if they can find a way to advocate, which is sometimes, when you're watching it, feels somewhat like tame and timid, but make it across to more voices than, the person who's yelling it and poking the bear. It's a balancing act. Truthfully, I've never figured out myself. I've worked on it. I have posted on my social media, I've posted things that are pro Mormons, and I get DMs about it that are hateful. And then I post things that are anti-Mormon or progressive, and I get DMs. What happened to you? Why are you saying that? So it is, I think it's a balancing act. There are people that do a good job, but I actually think that revelation trickles upstream. And I think members in the church, there's Facebook groups of people that are strong members of the church that have queer kids and queer loved ones. And I've been on that the last few days, and it's blowing up because all of these people are thinking, can I remain part of a church that is coming at my kid and my loved one? Like, at what point do I stand in front of the bullet for my kid? And there are people leaving, and I think that actually speaks at the bottom line might be the dollar.
You know, I have a different experience of that, never having been in the church. So as an outsider's perspective and learning everything I have about the church from its members or former members, but I never meet a Mormon couple that's coming to me for help and think, wow, I really need to talk them out of being Mormon. They get to tell me. That's what an ethical therapist is. They tell me, we're still in the church, we still believe, but we're having an issue in this area. How do we help? How do we help this thing function within this paradigm of being active believing members? And that's the job. That's the goal. It's not anything I've got going on. It's what they've got going on. And I love doing that. I don't have a dog in the fight. It's not my agenda. I help people get to where they want to be with where they're at and how they want it to fit in with their lives. But I do have one thing to say to the LDS church, and that's, you're very good at othering people. You're very good at making them feel like they don't fit in. You're also very good at building some community, but you're very good at making people feel like deep down inside there's something wrong with them. And I keep seeing these people, and it's the forever paradox of therapists and clients. Being a successful therapist means you don't have your clients leave. That's therapists are always trying to get rid of their clients because that's the measure of success, right? But all I got to say is, I don't know if you mean to, but you keep supplying an endless list of them.
Well, and one of the trends in Utah that I think is specific to Utah, from what I hear, is flying your flags. You know, having the trans flag, having the LGBT, the queer flag out during the month of June. And like, I've had people come in from out of town, they're like, what is up with the flags in Utah? And I was like, I think when you live in a state where there's so much against you, it's your way of advocating, like, there is safety here. And there are, from what I've heard from people, so this is not statistic, this is just in the mind of me, but they're like, well, where we live, people assume you're an ally. You wouldn't have to raise the flag. And I think in Utah, you want to raise your flag in some way. And I think that's what you're talking about. How do we raise the flag metaphorically to get this to stop? Like, how do we not sit? I mean, I think, you know, out of habit, I'm probably good at being complacent because I grew up yielding and obeying and being complacent. Like, it's a really, like, kind of awesome space, right? You just kind of sit back. And being an advocate has definitely been something I've been working on for the last 10 or 15 years, being able to use my voice and advocate better. But I think this is a really interesting question, because you're right. You want to think about your role ethically, and also your defensiveness of this community and wanting things to change within an organization that really has a lot of control over just the energy and soundbite of the state as far as how we treat each other. I mean, there's really not a nicer place than Utah. Mormons are so nice as they shut the bathroom door and won't let you in, right? They very kindly are like, I'm sorry, you need an escort, right? It's a very, very nice way of shutting people down. And I think that's one thing that makes it so hurtful. It'd almost be easier if they gave you the bird. But I think some of it's just the way that they kindly go about stabbing. Yeah.
Well, it's like domestic violence. It's always easier when there's a bruise than when there's emotional harm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just to be clear, as we're finishing up the discussion, and maybe this is where I'll make it a little bit personal if I haven't already, but is for me, it's not about leaving or staying in the church, right? To me, that shouldn't even really be the discussion. I know that that's eventually what a lot of people get to, right? Is, can I stay in a space where my mental health, where my sexual health, where my identity is not honored? Because we do know that when you stay in places where your authenticity is not honored, it does impact your ability to live healthily. Mm-hmm. And that even impacts your physical health, right? Because we know our emotional health then causes stress and heart conditions and immunity, issues and all, so our physical health, we can live less years in our life if we are not in affirming, healthy spaces mentally. So to me, it just seems like so violent that people have to make a decision between their faith, their God, their beliefs, which is a huge also part of their identity, and their gender identity, and specific of what we're talking about today, in order to just stay alive 10 years longer than they would otherwise. And that's the harm that I'm trying to speak to. It's not that the solution is, oh, all trans members should leave the church, or all trans members should stay in the church, or all their family members should or shouldn't stay in the church, or even us as therapists should or shouldn't be members of the church. That's not even my point. My point is, why is it that we have come to a place where that seems to be one of the only choices, right, that people are having to face, is to divorce one aspect of themselves in order for their other aspect of them to thrive. So either you have to divorce your gender because you're going to be a member of the church and show up in ways that are really unhealthy for you, or you're going to divorce your church, which may help you be more authentic, but that doesn't come at no cost either, right? To have your spirituality, in a sense, ripped away from you. And my whole point is, I was getting excommunicated largely for my professional beliefs, but also because I'm a mother of a trans child. Sorry. Why did they get to be more Mormon than me? Why do the cis kids get to be more Mormon than my kid? Why can't we also be part of the family in ways that are healthy for us? My goal was never to leave the church. I desperately wanted to stay. I desperately wanted to have the church, who was in that time my biggest ally in helping me raise my children, not be harmful to my children. So I really see this more from a family systems lens. I learned very quickly in Family Therapy 101 that although sometimes cutoffs are necessary, they're usually not healthy. They're usually not healthy. And I think we're going through a phase right now in the pop psychology field where everybody's cutting everybody off and canceling everybody. This is not a healthy way to do family systems. So to have these very simplistic, arguments that I hear from both sides. Well, why don't you just leave the church if it's harming you? Why would you be part of a church community that harms you? Or, well, why don't you just stay and choose your testimony in obedience, right? And trust the Lord, or whatever these arguments are on both sides. They are not addressing the issue that we are an unhealthy family system right now. And that's what I'm trying to bring attention to, right? That we can do better. We can be a healthier family system. And I think church communities are family systems. They are the number one place where people go for help outside of extended family. And that's true of any religion. People go to their pastors, people go to their priests, people go to their rabbis, people go to their bishops way before they go to mental health professionals. They count on their church community members who they worship with and commune with and work alongside with much quicker than they do even their next door neighbors. And so what are we doing to make these church families healthier for all the kids? And why do the privileged kids get to belong while those who are not as privileged, or those who speak up because they're feisty and emotional like me, and I'll own it every day, that we don't get to belong anymore? Right. And I hope I'm not sharing anything super out of confidence, but my kiddo, who we did take the bullet in front of our kid when they were 14, and we stopped attending church, not because we had lost our testimonies, not because we didn't believe, not because I didn't find my spirituality valuable inside an LDS chapel, but because my kid was getting harmed. So we stopped attending that particular ward. That happened when that kid was 14. It's been a decade, and things like this, even though they have zero desire to be part of this church that has discriminated against them. But these kinds of announcements still hurt my kid.
No.
Still hurt my kid a decade later, after they are not really involved in the church community anymore. And of course, as a parent of that, it's extremely painful. And yeah, it's like telling my parents, stop hurting your grandkid. And it's my job to do that as a parent. If my parents, whom I love and whom I respect and whom I don't want them to hurt and I'm not saying this actually of my parents, but I'm just giving an example.
Right.
If my parents are doing something to my kid, I need to, as the parent, I need to say, stop. But I don't want to have to say, well, you can no longer see your grandchild, and we are out. We're never going to see you again. And that is really what the church is putting people in a position to have to do when they continually, this is not a one-time thing, they continually harm our LGBTQ kids. And I do think that's the responsibility of parents. And I think it's the responsibility of doctors and therapists and associations, like you mentioned, Alan, to say this behavior is harmful. And it needs to stop. So that's my little personal soapbox. Any final thoughts from either one of you?
I just keep waiting for them to turn the corner and be more inclusive instead of exclusive.
Thank you for sharing that, Natasha. I think that it's very easy for people to misunderstand because they don't have that situation. And so they minimize the pain associated with it. I think people minimize the pain associated with leaving in all forms. And you're right. I thought that was really beautifully said, and it does hurt. And that is the root of the problem. And we do tend to band-aid the bleeding instead of ever getting to the root.
And I think too, back to the family thing, it's like these policies that the church makes gives a script now for how people are going to act in their own homes. Because I have my own family members telling both me and my trans kid, that they don't want that influence on their kids, right? Or their family systems. And so in a sense, the church is role modeling to families how they now can and even should behave, not just in a church building, but in your own homes and in your family reunions and in your spaces, that discriminate and leave these trans members of our family systems extremely vulnerable. And it's just maddening, right? And I know at some level we are all trying to protect our children. So I do try to remember that. But when you're trying to protect your child from the differences that my child presents, yeah, we're going to have a bit of a mama bear come together.
For sure.
So thank you so much for spending this time with us here at the Natasha Helfer Podcast. As you can see, this is another difficult time that the LDS community is going to be facing. I am sure people will understand that when these types of announcements come out, things like the Utah Crisis Center, the Suicide Crisis Line usually have increased calls. We as mental health practitioners usually have increased calls of people trying to come in and see us, because this ends up being kind of family crisis times for folks in these situations. And I want to remind everybody that this is not just a trans issue. This is a family issue. So if you have a trans child, if you have a trans cousin, if you have a trans member of your family, which I can pretty much guarantee every family does, all you need to do is at least go into the cousins or second cousins line to find them. This affects us all. And when we exclude another, we are actually harming ourselves. And if there's anything that I learned from Christ's messages, is to stop doing that. So I'm hopeful that we can all remember what I would, really hope we would consider gospel teachings versus church policies, stereotypes and bias that are of the times and that are traditions we need to abandon. So that's my call. And I hope that any who are listening, who are in a vulnerable space, please get the help you need. And we'll definitely in the show notes share suicide hotline resources and things of that nature. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Na tishki say the Navajo. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Years of our human history etched on her canyon halls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now is geschehen, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Not is geschehen, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.